Well, good afternoon. Can you all hear me? Great. I just want to start off by expressing my gratitude to Felice, Yet, Patricia, and their colleagues at Contemporary Art Museum Houston for welcoming me here. It's a real pleasure to be back in Houston. I'm going to start with a question for you all. And I ask this question because I think it's helpful for me to know what you know. I like to meet my interlocutors where they are. And I'm just wondering who here is familiar with the Zoot suit or the Zoot look? Okay, great. So some people. What do you know about it? What can you tell us about it? Anyone who raised their hand? Yeah.
I just got done with fashion history, so it was the Hispanics in Los Angeles, I think, started wearing it, and the thing is that they tried to criminalize the Zoot suit itself because it was taking up more fabric than, say, the regulation, although they violated regulation with trench coats and stuff all the time. And so it was a way to pinpoint Hispanics, and so the military men actually started a riot with them, picking on them as being un-American. It's a really pivotal point in the history. It's really, and it's funny how cinema at that time really kind of co-opts these things as being super thug and everything. It's all so racist. It's unbelievable.
Okay, so thank you. A+. Yes, so yes, the Zoot look was definitely associated with Hispanics, and it was thrust into the media spotlight during the Zoot suit riots, which you mentioned just now, the Zoot suit riots that took place in LA in June of 1943. And it was a look that was criminalized for many reasons, one of which was that it was seen as excessive during the Second World War, which was this moment of scarcity and sacrifice.
They were right. Actually, I'm sorry. It was an actual regulation.
Yes, there was a regulation limiting the use of wool in particular. It was supposed to go toward military uniforms. And then you mentioned popular culture, and yeah, the whole idea of 20th century cool is so indebted to the Zoot look. Like, I grew up with Happy Days, the Fonz. I don't know if any of you remember that, but I'm in another time zone. What's a famous actor's name? Giant. James Dean, Elvis Presley's Pompadour, all of that. If you watch Orson Welles' Touch of Evil, there are these characters who are coded lesbian, butch, and their look is very pachuco, I would say, pachuco. So the Zoot look, yes, thank you for your response. It is a look that is often associated with Mexican American men in particular. It was popular among many different groups. What they had in common for the most part was that they were working class youths. Cab Calloway popularized the look in the 1943 film Stormy Weather. This is a still from the film, and it was a look that was popular among African Americans. It was associated with Harlem and the jazz scene. The clothing is a very salient part of the Zoot subculture, but music, jazz, swing, dancing, jitterbugging, Lindy hopping, and speech, language were also really important components of the Zoot subculture. It was more than sartorial. And in terms of language, like if you ever read Malcolm X's autobiography, he opens a chapter in jive, in Zooter talk. And he himself, when he was, Detroit Red, Harlem Red, he wore the Zoot look as well. I have just a few more images I want to share. This one is from the Japanese American National Museum in LA. And here we see two young Japanese American men posing in front of a car. And this was like a kind of sub-genre of photography, like stand in front of this car wearing your nice clothes. The young man on the right, George Shibata, is wearing a sort of early variation of the Zoot look. This photo here, which goes back to 1942, is of a young man, Hermino Sanchez Lara. I found it in Lowrider magazine, and this is something I'll talk about more later. But he is posing in a studio, like that's a backdrop behind him. And so people took great pride in their clothing, in these ensembles. They bathed, and then they went and they paid someone to take their photo. And then, yes, as was pointed out a moment ago, the Zoot look is also, it was associated with criminality during the Second World War, in particular with juvenile delinquency and Mexican-American gangs. And this is the image that appears on the cover of my first book, The Woman in the Zoot Suit. These are suspected members of the all-girl gang, the Black Widows, being taken into police custody in August of 1942 in LA. This was after the Sleepy Lagoon incident. This was a fight at a party during which a young man was effectively beaten to death, a young Mexican immigrant man, and the law enforcement in Los Angeles used his death as an opportunity to conduct dragnet raids, to basically do what's known today as stop and frisk, gang injunction, and racial profiling. And so the Zoot look, the Zoot subculture, these events around it are very much connected to the policing of Black and brown bodies in particular. And yeah, these women, it was extraordinary for women to wear pants outside of work during the Second World War. Women began to wear pants at work. It was considered more acceptable. Celebrities like Katharine Hepburn wore them. That was considered very risque. But for the most part, women were expected to wear Mexican American women in particular were expected to adhere to a certain look. I think I will stop here because my next slide actually has to do with the question I have. So I don't know if you wanted to share your slides first or if I should start asking you our questions.
I'll probably move to slides if conversation comes up.
I think if we go like that. There we go.
Oh, I just wanted to show images, but just throughout the conversation.
Oh, okay, throughout the conversation. Okay, great. Okay, well then let's get started. Welcome, Troy. It's an honor to be in conversation with you. And I just want to ask you at the outset about your own, origin story. When and where did you first encounter the Zoot look? And what was your reaction? Can you tell us how you felt, what you saw?
I think everyone can hear me. I think the first time I encountered it was just growing up in El Paso. It was pretty prominent with like lowrider culture. Also, certain friends that would go to quinceañeras, family members, would be wearing Zoot suits. So it's kind of something that was special to have a suit made for a special occasion. I know we're going to be talking about Lowrider magazine, but a lot of my visual references came from magazine culture in the 90s, and Lowrider was one of the magazines where I would always look through it to get drawing techniques, and that was also prevalent in the magazine.
And I just want to add, and correct me if I'm wrong, so Troy is from El Paso and you were born in 1985. And so I just find it so interesting that the Zoot look had this resurgence. You know, you said, so when around 2000, when you would have been going to quinceañeras or knowing people attending quinceañeras, yes, there was this song by this band called the Cherry Popping Daddies. It's not a very good song, but it came out in 1997, and it really brought renewed attention to the Zoot Suit riots, you know, the subject of the song, and then the Zoot look and so on. And when I was a kid in LA in the 1970s, there was this resurgence of the Zoot look because of the play and film Zoot Suit by Luis Valdez, which premiered in LA in 1978. And so the Zoot look sort of merged with like the late 70s disco look. And I recall like my older sister going out wearing like a late 20th century interpretation of the Zoot look. So as I was excavating the history of Mexican American women for my book, I unexpectedly found Lowrider magazine to be a rich resource of images. And again, I don't know if many of you are familiar with Lowrider, but this is a magazine that was about cars. And almost every single cover featured a scantily clad, brown, ostensibly Latina woman posing in front of a car. And Lowrider had this section called Lowriders Pasados, in which readers were asked to submit photos of old cars, and going back to that subgenre of photography of like, you know, the young person decked out posing in front of a car. Lowriders Pasados was full of these images, and that's where I first started seeing photos of women Zoot Suiters, Mexican American women Zoot Suiters, mostly in the 1940s, early 40s, in this Lowriders Pasados section. And so I had to ask Lowrider for permission to include these images in my own book, and Lowrider turned out to be very generous, you know, with the permissions and very accommodating. And ironically, you know, I was writing this feminist queer recovery. My book was a feminist queer recovery project. And so I would just love to hear more about your sources and the materials that you use here in Rockavai. So where do you find these images, sewing patterns, textiles, and how do your sources inspire or challenge you? And time permitting, if you want to talk about a particular work, I would love it if you just told us more about your sources.
Sure. Trying to get used to the microphone. Maybe in that. You're going to reference that one right away.
And I put it there for you.
Okay. This one that's in the show, Piensa en mí, is titled after a Chavela Vargas song. But in terms of resources, I've always kind of been drawn to print media, particularly movies, like movie posters, magazines. And it's funny now, I think back with this time of solitude in the pandemic, that I've always kind of been interested in that. And as a kid, I would always draw over newspapers, like I would erase the people and then redraw them in graphite. So I've always kind of been using this kind of circulatory media, but specifically I was interested in these erotic men's magazines from the 70s and 80s, and that was sparked out of kind of an interest of earlier images from Physique Pictorial, but I noticed that it was predominantly white men. And so once I discovered that there were other magazines that featured men of color, they were very stereotypical, and I kind of wanted to do something where it was almost like a gesture to kind of break their placement, or like static placement throughout history, and to just kind of counter that gaze of being consumed by white queer men. And a lot of them, I mean, a lot of artists have talked about this, from like Glenn Wigan has addressed this with his work, but specifically there seemed to be like this repetition of the brown or black body as an object even with the style of lighting, often black and white, high contrast. So that's where a lot of the magazines kind of started. And initially, this piece, Piensa en mí, I was thinking a lot about just the election of 2016 and the blatant idea of criminality that was being applied to Mexican people, to border culture. So I kind of took that imagery away and focused more on found things. So a lot of the clothing in the work is actually my own clothing that gets recycled. So I feel like I'm always recycling my own materials. What else? Found photographs. I sourced those from eBay a lot. And then I'm always in thrift stores. I also, this particular work, it doesn't always happen, but I also pull from my own family archive. So the image on the far right with like the cutout of a boy is me. I was probably like 8 years old. Some of them are old collage works as well. And then all of the paper pieces are painted paper with gouache, acrylics. And I should say, it's kind of a funny story. My roommate, when I first moved to New York and I needed material, she would go to Portland, Oregon every summer. And I think Portland at the time had the largest erotic warehouse. So I was like, Christina, I just need any kind of erotic magazine you can find with brown and black men. So she would always go to Portland and come back with a stack of magazines for me.
What an assignment.
Yeah, but I mean, she was down, and I didn't realize how hard they would be to find. So I feel like I have purchased quite, I feel like all of the 70s and 80s black gay porn, or almost all of it, but I still scan everything. So even though in a way I feel like I'm transforming an archive, I still scan it to preserve it.
Before you cut it up and assemble. Yeah, okay. So you mentioned that you mentioned the white queer gaze. The Zoot look was and remains spectacular. Young Mexican Americans, African Americans, Filipino Americans made their presence known in cities like LA and New York, El Paso, when they wore the Zoot look in the early 1940s, late 1930s. At the same time, they were fixed by law enforcement, journalists, judges, and academics, other authorities, as queer, violent, alien, aberrant, criminal, etc. And I'm just wondering if you could tell us more about whose gaze your works subvert and who your intended audience or audiences are.
I think the gaze I'm trying to subvert is just kind of the larger, this larger kind of basis that happens in mass media, where I feel like narratives are always being erased by people of color or queer people, women, and I've always kind of had that fascination. Really earlier painting works, when I was an undergrad, I was creating large movie posters and often casting myself as a character, as the monster. And it's funny because when I think you're a young artist, you don't realize the thing that keeps coming up, and in many different forms. And this was something that always happened with whatever various material I touched. But I do think the gaze is something that I'm always interested in, and just the way that we kind of mark people based on appearance, based on our own fashion. And in terms of the viewer, it's tricky because I feel anybody can be the viewer. I've never really been like, this work is specifically for this audience, but I am putting specific images and materials that I want audiences of my background to recognize. So it's not important for me if everybody knows necessarily that this is a photograph from El Paso, but I know people from El Paso will see, there's one photograph in a piece that says like Isleta School District, so they'll know that it's from that place. But I do feel like that's the thing that happens sometimes with looking at artwork, is just giving a piece of work some time to kind of sit with it and gauge it, even if it's beyond our own experience.
Yes, you bring up El Paso, and I'd like to return to El Paso right now. You've attributed in different interviews what you've called your collage mentality to your hometown. And you've described the US-Mexico border as your first experience with the language of collage. Could you tell us more about what you mean by collage mentality and how El Paso and the US-Mexico borderlands shape your work?
I think it came from just an interest in like amalgamation of culture. And oftentimes, or when I first left El Paso to go to grad school, I didn't realize how different my upbringing was, that I grew up in this highly militarized zone, the presence of Fort Bliss, like second or largest military base in the country, the border and border patrol. And it's kind of funny, when I was in Connecticut, I was shocked at how quickly you could get to other states, like to Rhode Island. And one of my friends, I was like, where's the checkpoint where they ask us if we're American, and the weighing station? And she was like, what are you talking about? And I was like, I thought you have to do that every time you cross a state line. And she was like, no. And I was like, weird, like this is so particular to El Paso. So it's instances like that like a huge part of the work too is camouflage, but I grew up seeing camouflage my whole life, soldiers and this kind of desert camo. And I think it's just this transference of like, even though there is a border, the city itself doesn't feel like it is that separated, because so many people are going back and forth.
Like to Juarez,
also from New Mexico.
Yes.
But it was kind of, its presence was pretty intrusive in that as a kid. I also didn't realize it was normal, or not unusual, to go to school at every level with students who speak Spanish only, which for me I was like, well, that makes sense. But as a kid, I always remember this sense of feeling like there's this side and that side, and questioning, why am I allowed to be on this side and the other person is allowed to be on this side? And I think with collage, a lot of times it's kind of pairing these disparate materials and forcing dialogues to happen. And that's kind of what drew me to the medium. But also this kind of breakdown of language, where at home we spoke Spanish and English like in the same sentence. So it wasn't, even though we were kind of bisected by the border culturally, it was just amalgamated.
Yeah, so I had a similar experience. Like, I didn't realize I was a minority until I went to college, and I started receiving all these letters and invitations to like minority student, because where I grew up, it was like, I mean, I to this day I can't believe my last name is Ramírez. Like, I still have to spell it in Northern California, in Santa Cruz, where I live now. But yeah, I was like, I'm a minority. Like, where I come from, there's a whole bunch of people like me. So I want to circle back to what you just said about El Paso and the military presence there, the border checkpoints, the camouflage. So you have described a palimpsest. You know, this is a space, a work, a text, in which there are multiple layers. And we talk in critical Latinx indigeneities, for example, about the layers of coloniality. Like here, in a place like Houston, for example, you know, where Houston, like so many other places, is a crossroads. But for me, at least, like I sense the palimpsest here. You know, you feel the Mexican with the Anglo, and then of course at the foundation is the indigenous. And your work is, you work with, collage, and a number of critics have remarked, they've commented on that. But I'm wondering, where do we encounter the palimpsest in your work? Those different layers, temporal layers, layers of meaning, linguistic layers, basically the refusal or an inability to erase, but still like these competing texts or histories or meanings.
I mean, it's in the layers, like you mentioned, but it's also just kind of a respect for history. I spent a lot of time with my grandparents growing up, and one thing I always kind of appreciated that I had the luxury of is I felt like they were laying out the blueprint for experiences that I might encounter, and I was always just really struck by that. And I don't know, I'm always, as a kid, history was always my favorite classes. I was always excited to learn something new that I'd never known. And I don't know, I feel like people are always saying knowledge is power, but I definitely feel like it is. And in terms of the material, like I feel like the future is always the past. Like as much as people may try to erase the past, like it always kind of comes back up. It's always there remaining. And I do think about the work in terms of layering, when I'm making, kind of pushing and pulling, cutting back into something, ripping through something, sewing, sanding as well. I had, in undergrad, I worked, I guess, for the government in a way, but I was hired to do artifact drawings for this group called TRC Environmental. And they needed more hands to help, so they trained me in excavation. And I always remember thinking that that was going to be influential for me. So kind of the archaeological square, kind of digging layer by layer, and then writing information down was really important. And in many ways I see history in that way, but also history isn't necessarily linear.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's great. Thank you. And yeah, I just want to know, like, where are you headed? What are you cooking up now? What inspires or troubles you? Where are you going to take us next?
That's a good question. I feel like it was really important for me to have this last kind of large zipper piece, mainly due to your book, which is why I'm so excited to talk to you. But I feel like that's the last chapter of the Zoot work, so I do think about every iteration as a chapter. And I guess I could show some of I don't know if you had seen, I may have to this is just to give you a view. I do work in many different modes of collage, so photomontage, assemblage, decollage. I'm trying to get to the other stuff. These are handmade paper prints that are carved into and then dyed, but all kind of referencing pachuches.
And the tacuche that's the Pachuco slang term for the ensemble, the conjunto, the outfit, the slacks, the coat. Sometimes the wearer wore atando, like the broad-brimmed hat, the long watch chain, etc.
I think where I'm going now is drawing. So I love teaching foundation classes, and it's kind of brought me back to the thing I love doing ever since I was 4 years old, which is drawing. And my mom would always be like, you were the weirdest kid because you could draw for like 5 hours. Like you were easy. I knew if I gave you crayons, you were fine. Often I spent time in libraries and at museums because they were free for my mom to take me. But even teaching drawing, I realized how much of my own collage making is related to line and gesture. So these are some recent drawings from this last show in March. So kind of many different layers of Conti, kind of sanded over, sewn over, and then kind of resanded. And a lot of these were taken just from the language of advertising from these catalogs. This one's called Jitterbugs. So the drapes. But I wanted to show you the Ramona
And what are the
Fonseca.
materials here?
Conti.
Okay.
Yeah. And that was the one
Oh,
that,
Ramona Fonseca.
So
yeah.
Ramona Fonseca became a really important role in the show, and I wanted to make sure that, I don't know, I was kind of able to show versatility of the garment. And that's where the last chapter kind of ended. But I'm doing some research at Amistad. It's been so much fun to go to New Orleans. I'd never been before. I love the culture, the food was really good. And the Amistad team was just amazing. Like, we would be in conversation and they would be like, oh, did you say something about this? And let's give you this information on that. But I did become really interested in these scrapbooks that I found from various Harlem Renaissance artists. So like County Colin, Richmond Barté, Harold Jackman. So I'm thinking a lot about still pictures, but maybe this idea of like photo albums and research. And that's kind of, I'm still in the development phase. So it takes me some time, I think, kind of compiling all the different elements. And then there's also a making phase where I'm kind of learning what the visual output's gonna be.
Yeah, and this one is very photographic. Like, this looks like a negative, you know. And Ramona Fonseca was a young woman who lived in LA in the San Fernando Valley, and this photo of her posing in a studio wearing the masculine version of the Zoot look, el tacuche, is at the LA Public Library as part of its Shades of LA collection. So just different families, individuals from around LA contributed photos, ephemera to the LA Public Library's Shades of LA collection. Her photos ended up in there. That's how I found them. And again, like, I was just like really taken aback to see a young Mexican-American woman in the Zoot suit. Yeah, that work was foundational to my book project too. So what a pleasure to see it rendered in this way here. Yeah.
I think that's where, I mean, I told you that I felt like your book had filled in so many gaps from other research that I had done and answered those questions, but it felt important for me to kind of show representation for the femme Zoot suiter, because I realized so many people didn't know that she existed, but I knew growing up that there was both pachucos and pachucas, and I never gendered the garment, but people just assumed it was a garment only worn by men.
No, and so just a couple things. The term pachuco, there are some scholars who claim that it's linked to El Paso, that because, you know, people, what is the etymology of this word, pachuco, pachuca, that it's pachuco slang for El Paso. And then, yeah, just the women's participation. If you grew up in the culture, you knew. I mean, I knew. And my father would say to me and my friends when I was a teenager that he didn't like the way we looked because we looked like pachuca. It's like, that's too much makeup, your hair is too high, that skirt is too high. And when I was your age, I would have crossed the street if I saw a girl who looked like you. This is what he told my friends and me as, you know, we got ready to go out in the 1980s. And so yes, the pachuca was very present in my adolescence in LA in the 80s. But when I got to graduate school, like, I was told by more than one prospective advisor, oh, well, you can't write a dissertation about women Zoot suiters because there simply isn't going to be enough material. Like, there were so few of them, or there were none. Like, there was, doubt expressed.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's amazing. It's amazing to see how this image has traveled. So thank you.
Thank you.
I don't know if you want to share any more images, or if we want to open the floor.
I'll just show you a few from the rest of the show. Oh, I guess that was it. Oh,
Oh, I love that one.
so one thing that's different with the large zipper piece, so I wasn't using the men's erotic magazines to talk about pachucas, which is obvious maybe, but I wanted to focus on department store catalogs and the way like advertising works and trying to get us to attain to these new identities or what we could become if we had this garment or if we had this object. And so I sourced catalogs from Montgomery Ward and Sears, and specifically thinking about things that the women in my family would have looked at that time. And it was kind of the reverse, where a lot of the other Zoot work, it was about trying to complicate the gaze of the male figure, but not denying him like his sexiness, but just trying to change it up a little bit. But with this body of work with the pachuca, it was more about exposing, just to show that there was existence. So I started doing a lot of drawings on the department store catalogs, and I don't work with sketches, and ultimately I do feel like the work will speak to me. And I'm like, okay, I just did all those drawings and spent that time, and then now it wants me to glue it into the larger work. So those kind of became these vertical lines. But that's just a little bit about that show. And sculpture, sorry, I forgot.
Oh, wow.
There's a number of drying rack sculptures, and I was always fascinated by these drying racks growing up at home, just in the amount of space that they took. And it was always, there's something just very like, what is the word? Like you had to wash your clothes all the time, so I was always interested in their presence when we had to dry the clothes, but then you just fold them up and you put them back and you hide them. And there's something that also felt like bodies to me. So I had some steel kind of folding racks fabricated. And then there was also these shirts that were fabricated out of fiberglass. And that was kind of a nod to my grandmother in that you couldn't leave the house without ironing. Like you would be stopped like in your tracks. And I still love to iron. I love the heavily starched shirt, but also thinking of my grandparents like super starched clothing. So in a way it's like it was still speaking a lot towards like my home life, but kind of also abstracted through the pachuca.
Yeah. We are just about out of time. So I want to thank you, Troy Montes Michie. I want to thank our host, the Contemporary Art Museum of Houston, and you for attending.